Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? My name is Nora Cooley, and I'm Communications Assistant at the Danvers Historical Society. I want to thank you all for watching, and I want to thank Diana, who coordinated us with Professor Drew Darien. Drew Darien is Chair and Professor of History at Salem State University, where he teaches 20th century United States history and oral history. He is the author of Becoming New York's Finest, Race, Gender, and the Integration of the New York City Police Department, and Building the Sacred and the Progressive, 75 Years at Temple Sinai. He is also the project director for SalemVeterans.com's an oral history project on college veterans. He will be speaking today about testimonials provided by members of the Towne Family Association and what they have to teach us about the legacies and memory of Salem witch trials. Please welcome Professor Drew Darien.
Nora, thank you so much for that introduction, and of course, thank you to you and to the Danvers Historical Society for hosting this talk. I wanted to begin maybe with just acknowledging a little bit of the peculiarity of this moment that we're in. I have no doubt that were this talk being given not in the age of COVID, that Tapley Hall would surely be filled with residents from Danvers and Salem who've always demonstrated a keen interest in local history. We also know that this is typically the time of year in which residents of Danvers and Salem brace themselves for what is surely the onslaught of thousands of tourists. And yet, I stand in this lovely memorial hall largely alone. And anybody who's been to downtown Salem in the past few weeks can tell you that it definitely lacks a good deal of its typical late summer and early fall vibrancy. And while, of course, we in Salem are used to wearing masks this time of year, there isn't any of the usual pre-Halloween playfulness that we've come to associate it with. This year, the masks are not only protection against a deadly virus, but they've taken on symbolic resonance as a kind of defense against the insecurity and fear and anxiety that have riddled all of our communities. And so since I am here today in part to talk about the connection between memory and the 1692 witch trials, I do think that there is something about that sense of anxiety, the somberness, and the seriousness of this moment that is perhaps most apt. So what I'd like to do for today is to share some thoughts and perspectives from an oral history project that I've been working on with the descendants of the Salem witch trials. And my hope is to be able to convey the place of memory in the trials and how it's informed by ancestry and genealogy. But before I do that, I do think it is worth thinking about what Salem typically looks like this time of year and how the city's decision to brand itself as ground central for Halloween has shaped its identity and how it has informed what some ancestors would argue is a misunderstanding about the trials. So every year, about 250,000 people descend upon Salem for the month of October to partake in haunted happenings, that month-long celebration of witch kitsch, ghost tours, psychic readings, magic expositions, games, rides, and what always seems to be an inordinate amount of fried dough and powdered sugar. And yes, it's true that the city does have some fine, historically minded walking tours that try to grapple with the lessons of 1692, but it's also clear that that has largely become a sideshow to this month-long party on behalf of Halloween. Visitors might take in the grandeur of Salem's federal and colonial architecture. They might explore the remarkable collections of Asian art at the Peabody Essex Museum. They may even stroll the manicured grounds of the House of Seven Gables, and they might even take a reverential pause at the Witch Memorial. But most come to be spellbound. It's very clear that history and social justice, at least in the month of October, take a back seat to enchantment and entertainment. We should note that there is no historical link between Halloween and the Salem witch trials. That is very much an invented tradition that starts about 40 or 50 years ago and is initiated by Salem's business and political elite. It's something that is very much the product of marketing, tourism, and popular culture. Many of you are probably familiar with the Samantha Stevens statue that sits in the center of downtown Salem and had been dedicated in 2005. That statue commemorates the 1970 episode known as Salem Saga from the popular television show Bewitched. And there is something about having the most popular television witch in all of American history come to Salem that really helps the city start this more modern process of branding itself for mass consumption. And in fairness, some of the antecedents of its branding itself as Witch City start in the early 20th century, but it really takes off in the early 1970s. At about that time, some of Salem's local institutions like the Chamber of Commerce, the local paper, and the police department adopt Witch City as their logo. Then in 1971, Lori Cabot, a Wiccan and a California transplant, comes to Salem, ultimately declares herself to be the city's official witch, and opens a downtown shop selling witchcraft paraphernalia. The year after that, in 1972, an old church that had been used as an auto museum reopens as the Witch Museum, and now the city has a new vehicle for telling outsiders its story. By 1982, the Salem Chamber of Commerce sees the potential to draw upon the connection between Halloween and the witch trials, and it's at that moment that it officially establishes haunted happenings. And it's pretty clear that there's a good deal of money to be made in the witchcraft industry, and I also think it's safe to say that Salem has been in many ways saved by tourism, perhaps spared some of the other economic misfortunes that have befallen post-industrial cities in New England. It's clear that Salem has revitalized its economy by branding itself as a witch-friendly place. It has also become not only a magnet for Wiccans, but also Goths, alternative musicians, unconventional healing therapies, vegan cuisine, and a little bit of colonial and maritime history thrown in for good measure. I think what troubles historians of the witch trials is this great gulf between what they see as the serious questions and ethics that are embedded in their works and what they see as haunted happenings, often vulgar celebration of, and real ignorance about the execution of innocent victims. For academics, the tragic events of 1692 demand reverence rather than a month-long celebration. One of the areas that has received less scholarly attention is the public memory of the trials as they relate to genealogy and ancestry. New England families really in many ways have been guardians of that story for hundreds of years. And it's worth thinking about the degree to which their interpretation of the trials is consistent with those that are reflected in either popular or scholarly works. And so what we have are sort of three rough, intersecting and potentially conflicting versions of the interpretations of the events of 1692. Scholarly, popular, and what I would call ancestral. I'd also make the case that by looking at genealogy and descendant stories, we have a real opportunity to examine individual and collective identities, public memory, and perhaps even a hierarchy of claims about who is authentically American. So think, for example, of New Englanders who claim Yankee heritage. And I'm thinking of those people whose ancestry goes back to the Puritans or the Pilgrims or perhaps even the sons and daughters of the American Revolution. There's an inordinate amount of pride that comes with being able to trace one's roots to the founding or of early America. And that's certainly something that is true among the descendants of the Salem witch trial. It's also worth noting that that group is almost exclusively white, and so this means that the stories of the descendants of the witch trials is a fairly racially homogeneous one. And also for many years, genealogy has really been the domain of the privileged and the well-to-do, although I should note that that's changed quite a bit in more recent years with 23andMe and Ancestry.com. We've seen a real democratization in the exploration of ancestry. But that has not quite been as true in genealogical societies. That has largely been the domain of the white and the well-to-do. Now that doesn't make them inherently problematic, but it does suggest that that kind of ancestry may only tell an incomplete story. As a maritime city, Salem has always been a global city, which is ethnically, racially, religiously, and economically diverse. Those of you who've studied the Salem witch trials, just by way of example, know that it is really Tituba, a Caribbean slave who is either of Arawak Native American or African ancestry, depending on which scholars you most believe, most likely Arawak Indian. But clearly, she is the one who is at the center of the witchcraft hysteria. Scholars of the witch trials also focus on how much of the anxiety in Salem in the early 1690s is really a product of a fear of the surrounding Native American population with which it had come into conflict in several skirmishes and wars. And yet there is no genealogical society for Tituba, for Indian John, let alone any other Native Americans or enslaved Africans who were part of Massachusetts Bay Colony. There's no doubt that were we to have access to their stories, that would complicate our picture. That challenge of representativeness is something with which Salem continues to grapple today, especially as it relates to tourism. Now we know that Salem has some of the finest public-facing institutions and sites, like the House of Seven Gables, Salem Maritime Historic Site, the Corwin Witch House, the Peabody Essex Museum. And while all of these sites do a fantastic job of educating visitors about Salem's colonial and early American history, the focus of the artifacts, the architecture, the lives, and the stories are on the city's white Protestant settlers. Most visitors who come to Salem tend to learn less about the 18th century seaport, 19th century abolitionist activism, the Great Fire of 1914, the rise and fall of the textile industry, or the city's Irish, French-Canadian, Polish, Dominican, or Brazilian communities. Even today, Salem is more than 20% Black and Latino, including a significant Dominican population in an area known as the Point, which sits just adjacent to downtown, only a few hundred yards from the city's prime tourist attractions. And yet this is an area and a population that visitors tend to know nothing about. And if they do learn about the Point, it's usually to be forewarned to avoid it because of perceptions of crime. At the same time, we should recognize that Salem is in many ways a very progressive city that can be deeply introspective about its past and its present. There have been moments of deep community reflection, and many of these, in fact, relate to the lessons of the Salem witch trials. One small example of that is the organization known as Voices Against Injustice, which started in 1992 as the Salem Award Foundation, and it has an explicit goal of connecting the lessons of the trials to the contemporary landscape with regard to social justice and human rights. In 2017, my university, Salem State, partnered with the Salem Award Foundation and Essex Heritage to host a conference honoring the 325th anniversary of the trials. And while for the most part that was an academic conference, we came to learn that there was a good deal of interest from the descendants of both victims and accusers who wanted themselves to be part of those proceedings. And so, as the resident oral historian, I set up a recording booth in which descendants could talk about their specific ancestors, the significance of genealogy, and the contemporary lessons of the trials. As you might imagine, the descendants themselves were a pretty varied and eclectic bunch who were drawing very specific lessons about the trials and had different pockets of knowledge of what transpired in 1692. But something that collectively emerged from that initial set of, I'll call them informal testimonials, was a sense that they had an ancestral responsibility to be guardians of Salem's past. They were personally invested, not simply in telling the stories of and learning about their own ancestors, but imparting these deep lessons of intolerance, mob mentality, shame, fear, and even the fallibility of the justice system. That initial set of interviews ultimately led me to the Towne Family Association, which is the genealogical society for the descendants of William and Joanna Towne. The Townes migrated in the 17th century from Great Yarmouth, England, to Salem, Massachusetts, and they had 8 children. In 1692, 2 of their daughters, Mary Easty and Rebecca Nurse, were charged and hanged for witchcraft. A third daughter, Sarah Cloyce, was among the accused, although she was never indicted. So with 3 ancestors, especially the quite beloved and now martyred Rebecca Nurse, at the center of the witchcraft hysteria, Towne descendants, I think more than others, really see themselves as caretakers of a very fragile historical legacy. And so in the fall of 2017, I worked with a team of some of my fantastic graduate students to record a dozen of their oral histories. The people who were interviewed for this project were, quote, registered descendants of one of the most established genealogical associations tied to some of the best known victims of the trials. But again, I would caution you to think about the question of representativeness. The Towne Family Association is a relatively small group of about 500 self-selecting members who are surely a tiny fraction of the Towne family descendants. And you can just sort of pause for a moment and think about the math. Given that Rebecca Nurse alone had 9 children and 57 grandchildren, the number of Towne family descendants alive today is probably in the tens, if not the hundreds of thousands. And it's most likely that the vast number of Towne family descendants have no knowledge of their connection to these prominent historical figures. In addition to that, Rebecca Nurse, Mary Eastie, and Sarah Cloyce were only 3 of the more than 200 persons who were accused of witchcraft. So what I would like to do now is to offer some samples from the interviews that we conducted to demonstrate how some of the descendants are grappling with these legacies. A quite common and I think intriguing dimension of these descendant interviews was a kind of proprietary claim to both the city and the history of Salem. And that was really interesting because it would happen even if neither the descendant nor their more recent ancestors had lived in Salem or the area for quite some time. I want to start with an excerpt from Barbara Hanno, who is a 63-year-old descendant from Petersham, Massachusetts. And I've selected this clip because she's conveying what was a common frustration among the descendants about this kind of crass commercialization of the trials, especially the like of which we see in the month of October.
I've thought about that a lot because my first reaction is it's just, sacrilegious almost, and that it's hurtful to their memory. I've tried to justify it to think, okay, well, Salem needs their income to keep their place going, and if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to memorialize like they do and have the nice parks that they have. I would prefer it to be that it was more dignified and more reverential to the memory of people who, suffered and died and had their lives taken away from them and had their families ripped apart. I would prefer that maybe the witches would choose another place to live.
A similar and related frustration was communicated by Jeffrey Woodward, a descendant of Mary Eastie, and interestingly enough, the great-grandson of the 19th century historian and Salem witch trials expert W. Elliott Woodward. As you might imagine, a descendant of the victim as well as a descendant of one of the world's most renowned historians of the trials would be somebody who is exasperated by this kind of commercialization. But for Woodward, it's the ways in which visitors have appropriated the witch trials and Salem's identity as an expression of alterity or antisocial sentiment, or a kind of goth celebration of the dark side of life.
Well, I once went around, where the stones are behind the PBD6 Museum, and there was a line of people going around looking at everything. But I just got the feeling that a lot of this history, these people know nothing about it. Do you know what I'm saying? They've not been schooled in it. And then, I've worked at a place and I've seen people dressed up in costume and they're traveling to Salem, and it's literally, I've been told, thousands of people, and they're sort of sort of edgy type of people with nose rings and tattoos, and they sort of, I think, do disgrace to the history. Do you know what I'm saying? I do sort of feel, and I've only felt that more recently.
Okay.
I didn't know about all these people, that it's been made into sort of a cult, of sort of alternative, edgy people who like tattoos and pierced nose rings.
I should say that not every descendant was offended by the commercialization of the witch trials, and some actually saw it as a means of better educating the public about those very lessons. One example of this comes from John Keenan, who is the president of my university, Salem State. He's a Rebecca Nurse descendant, a longtime resident of the city, as well as a former state legislator. And anybody whose family has been in Salem as long as his has knows a thing or two about the manufacturing losses that Salem experienced during the course of the 20th century. But for Keenan, the tourism hasn't just saved the economic fortunes of the city, but actually better positioned it to impart its historical legacies.
A pragmatist, a practical, right? So I grew up in Salem. I've been here my entire life, and my father and grandfather worked in the leather factories, the Flint Tan, literally just now being transformed into residences down near Blubber Hollow. So when I grew up here, we had the tanneries, we had Parker Brothers, we had Osram Sylvania, we had all these manufacturing jobs. Yep. My aunt from Proctor Street worked at Parker Brothers, my dad worked at the Flint Tan. Those are all gone. Manufacturing jobs are gone one way. There's a balance in there, and I do think overall tourism has been good for Salem because it also gave us the opportunity to bring more people here and educate them as to what really happened. And then while they're here, maybe they have a chance to have some fun too. But overall, hopefully people, and that's part of what the Witch Memorial hopes to do, and the new memorial at Proctor's Ledge, to make sure people go away understanding the seriousness of what happened at that time, and hopefully think about today in terms of how we apply due process or other.
That call for due process and the reading of the past through the lens of the present was also reflected in the interview of Margot Burns, who is herself a witch trials expert, and along with Bernard Rosenthal, published the most authoritative collection of primary sources on the witch trials. And she is, I think, especially astute about the craft of history and this critical need in studying the past and thinking about the present for documentation and accuracy.
Well, the power of gossip is really potent, and you have to be very careful about what people say about others. In our political situation right now, there seems to be some kind of polarization between, I don't know, I don't believe there's anything such alternative facts, because facts are facts. Right. I think they're facts and they're lies. And I think trying to separate truth from fiction is even more important right now. And there have been so many fictions written and repeated about the Salem witchcraft trials, so that when somebody says something, I want to know, where did that come from? And that really informs a whole lot of my political take today, because how do we know what we know? And there's been such an attack by some people politically to try and undermine reality for their own political purposes. And that just really, it boggles my mind. I also think that the 45th President of the United States, who shall remain nameless, claiming that the biggest witch hunt is against him is just totally ridiculous. How dare he? But then again, the politicians here in Salem tweeted against that. Oh, really? Do you know your history? So I really think we need to figure out what facts are, and what we agree upon is how do we determine facts? Because then you can have interpretations. But if you mess with what you think is the truth, that really causes lots of problems. So I always want to know, what are the facts? How do you know? That's the other thing. How do we know what we know?
While all of the descendants discuss the centrality of facts, corroboration, and due process, and indeed in many ways folded them into contemporary political events, a few of the descendants found truth and meaning in the events of the witch trials on a more personal and spiritual level. Let me conclude by way of example with the testimony of Robert Corcoran, a 54-year-old man who learned about his connection to Rebecca Nurse at the same time that he was thinking about coming out to his family in the 1980s.
It's a coincidence that I discovered this descent from Rebecca Nurse at the same time as I was going through the process of coming out of the closet.
Right.
And certainly once I'd done the genealogy to find the connection to Rebecca Nurse, that was in and of itself exciting to find a connection with a historical figure.
Right.
In addition to that, though, it was exciting is the wrong word. It was, and moving isn't quite the right word either, but it was moving, it was inspirational. I'll come up with the right word. To read her testimony during her trial, and the gist of which, from my reading of it, was, I haven't done anything wrong. And why are you coming after me? I haven't done anything wrong.
Yes.
And that was a wonderful message to read and to have feel some sort of connection to as I was going through this process of coming out.
Right.
And there are many times during the course of that spring and summer, there's probably a 6-month period that I think of as my coming out period, when I would turn to her testimony every few days to read again. And it's only a few pages,
Right.
but it was just wonderful to have a connection to someone who went through this horrible experience where her message was, I haven't done anything wrong.
Right.
So that was wonderful, and something of a gift.
So I think it's clear that what we find in these interviews is a real breadth of descendants' perspectives on the trials, memory, identity, and the ways in which the past informs the present. An important qualifier that I've already noted is that these oral histories are only a tiny fraction of the tens of thousands of descendants of Rebecca Nurse and Mary Eastie. In addition to that, the responses from the members of the Towne Family Association might be quite different than those from other victims, let alone the perspective of accuser descendants, let alone the perspective of Native American or African descendants of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I think each of those areas represents some promising fruit for future research. And I have little doubt that their stories and perspectives will enable scholars to think about the city's past and the present in new and profound ways.